It's a gray, rainy day. Early afternoon in Washington, D.C., 1946. You're 12 years old and just got suspended again for getting into a fight with a classmate. You step outside and spot your parents waiting in the car by the street. You climb into the back seat. The moment the door closes, it gets heated quickly. Your parents start yelling. They say something's wrong with you, that you're not acting right. You snap and yell back. The argument goes on for a few minutes. Then, silence. A few minutes later, the car comes to a stop. You look outside, it's a hospital. No one is sick, so why are you here? They walk you into the office. The doctor is already waiting. When the doctor, with his cold, empty eyes, starts talking to you, he doesn't ask what's wrong. He just tells you you're broken. You aren't right, but that's okay. He's going to fix you. You try to get up, but before you can move, your parents help the doctor strap you into the chair. You kick, you scream. The doctor puts on a mask, but you can tell he's still smiling as he holds a hammer and an ice pick. He places the ice pick next to your eye. He pulls back with the hammer, and then nothing's the same after that. The anger fades. The disobedience melts away. But what else did you lose along with them? This is the story of America's most terrifying doctor, the arch-lobotomist Walter Freeman. In this video, we'll uncover the truth. Was he a brilliant neurologist whose method actually cured mental illness? Or was he a sociopath so obsessed with the brain that he ignored the lives of vulnerable children and adults? Walter Jackson Freeman II's path in life couldn't have been a surprise to anyone. He came from a long line of medical professionals and pioneers in the field of neurology. His ancestor, Stephen Camp, had founded the New Jersey Medical Society, while his grandfather, William Williams Kean, had been the first person to surgically remove a brain tumor in the United States and served as a medical advisor to Grover Cleveland and later FDR. With such a pedigree behind him, it was easy for Freeman to sail into his undergraduate studies at Yale and from there to Pennsylvania Medical School to follow in the family tradition. While Freeman was doing his medical training in Philadelphia, he studied under two famous neurologists, William Spiller and Charles Frazier. This is when he became fascinated with the human brain, especially mental illnesses like schizophrenia and depression. In the early 20th century, science's understanding of mental illness was still basic. The only treatments available were being sent to an asylum or being told to deal with it. He wanted to find better ways to treat mental illnesses like schizophrenia and depression. Upon graduation, Freeman's grandfather secured him a job at St. Elizabeth's Hospital in Washington, D.C., which had a reputation for its work with the mentally ill. Here, Freeman's showmanship and lack of respect for authority, medical and moral authority included, were unleashed. Freeman spent his time at St. Elizabeth's experimenting with unorthodox treatment for mental illness. This included electroshock therapy, oxygen deprivation, and sedation to test their effects on the mental condition of his patients. He was most fond of conducting spinal taps to drain spinal fluid, hoping to produce effects on the brain, and shrugged off his colleagues who warned of the dangers of such procedures. Freeman's methods demonstrated recklessness and insubordination, but not intentional cruelty. For all of his many faults, it is difficult to accuse Freeman of sadism or malice. He was truly sympathetic to the miserable conditions of mental patients, in a time when such conditions were barely understood. The standard treatment for such people at the time was to be locked up in a mental asylum for the rest of their lives, where they endured years of isolation and frequent mistreatment from staff. Freeman believed there had to be a better solution than that. While he attracted early critics, Freeman's enthusiasm for treating mental patients earned him plenty of praise. By the 1920s, Freeman had earned a reputation as a leading mind in America's mental health and neurological fields. He was appointed to simultaneous posts at George Washington and Georgetown universities, where he completed his PhD and published a landmark book. But Freeman wasn't just a medical professional, he was an entertainer. Wearing a wide-brimmed hat, donning a stylish goatee, and walking with a cane he didn't actually need, he looked and acted the part of a mad, eccentric scientist. His lectures attracted huge crowds of students who would fill the hall even on weekends. One of his favorite tricks was to simultaneously draw two parts of the brain on a chalkboard with either hand as he spoke. He'd even host live autopsies where he'd narrate to the audience and sometimes invite them to join in. In 1935, Freeman met neurosurgeon James Watts, who shared his commitment to tackling mental health issues with new methods. The two men became close colleagues and were equally excited when news reached them across the Atlantic of a stunning new discovery in their field. Portuguese neurologist Igás Moniz had performed a remarkable new surgery on a patient to disconnect pieces of the brain to treat depression. In March 1936, he published his findings after 20 of these so-called leucotomies and claimed 70% of the patients saw some or total improvement of their symptoms. Freeman and Watts were immediate fans. "I enjoyed particularly your recent work on the reduction of psychotic symptoms following operation on the frontal lobe," Freeman wrote to Moniz a few weeks later. "And I'm going to recommend a trial of this procedure in certain cases that come under my care." On September 4, 1936, Freeman and Watts performed the first ever leucotomy in the United States. Their subject was Alice Hood Hammett, a 63-year-old woman suffering from depression. Hammett initially agreed to the procedure, but on the morning of the surgery she tried to back out. Freeman ignored her. He would not pass up this chance to test his amazing new surgery. On his orders, Hammett was restrained, sedated, and anesthetized. The procedure involved making two careful incisions through the skull to access the brain, and then using a specialized tool to remove pieces of the brain matter from the frontal lobe. When Freeman and Watts were done, they cleaned the wounds and resealed them. The entire process took less than an hour. Hammett awoke shortly after, confused and struggling to speak, but also, in her own words, happy. She spent several days recovering before being discharged. Freeman hailed the procedure as a massive success. News of it spread quickly through the medical community and was on the front cover of every newspaper. The Washington Evening Star believed so, hailing it as one of the greatest surgical innovations of this generation. The age of the American lobotomy had arrived. Freeman and Watts became medical celebrities overnight. They rebranded the procedure from Moniz's leucotomy into a lobotomy and began taking on more patients. The public was fascinated, but expectations were skeptical. Medical professionals criticized them for not publishing their findings for peer review and for the poor job they did following up on their patients. Freeman and Watts weren't totally ignorant of a scientific method, and they were recording their work. By 1942, they had performed 200 lobotomies and found a 63% success rate. 23% showed no improvement, while 14% exhibited significant deterioration or death. They also determined that lobotomies only worked in some cases like depression or mood swings. It was not effective in treating conditions like schizophrenia, alcoholism, or criminal tendencies. But despite these limitations, Freeman was more than happy. In his eyes, so long as the lobotomy enables the patient to sleep on a bed instead of under the bed, it is worthwhile. However, that 14% failure rate was far higher than most surgeries. Drastic changes in personality, paralysis, a loss of motor or speech function, seizures, dementia, infection, abscesses, hemorrhages, and death were all a risk. Freeman's dismissive attitude to sanitation or sterilization, what he called all that germ crap, certainly contributed to that 14% failure rate. The most common negative effect was a sort of personality death. Lobotomized patients lost all sense of personality and energy, becoming dull, emotionless husks of themselves. What some people dubbed as a surgery of the soul often turned out like a removal of that soul entirely. Most patients didn't suffer these side effects, but Freeman didn't flinch at their existence either. To him, the dead or disabled were acceptable casualties in his crusade to lobotomize away America's mental problems. The most famous failure came in 1941 from none other than the Kennedy family. Already a powerful political dynasty, the Kennedys had a public image to maintain. So when Rosemary Kennedy, the elder sister of JFK and RFK, developed anxiety, mood swings, and epilepsy, the family was desperate for a solution. They had the money and pull to arrange an appointment with Freeman, who agreed to perform a lobotomy on her. The procedure went badly wrong. The lobotomy left Rosemary functionally disabled. She was unable to look after herself and struggled with basic functions, including eating, walking, and bathing. The Kennedy family was furious, blaming Freeman alone, but not themselves for taking her to him in the first place. Rosemary was carted off to an asylum where she was kept out of public view for the rest of her life, not even being allowed to attend her brother's inauguration or funeral. Rosemary Kennedy's fate was kept a secret for decades, but she joined a growing list of patients rendered disabled or dead by Freeman's work. But Rosemary's fate had no impact on Freeman. His only desire was for more experiments, more patients, more lobotomies. Freeman's next breakthrough, literally and figuratively, came in 1946 with his development of the transorbital lobotomy. Rather than bore a hole through the top of the skull, Freeman realized he could crack a hole through the orbital bone behind the eye and access the brain from there. To make the hole, he used a mallet and an orbitoclast, essentially an ice pick, and indeed, the very first procedures were performed with an ice pick from his kitchen. He could numb the area with electricity and wouldn't even have to put the patient to sleep. Such a procedure was faster to perform, cheaper, and had a lower recovery time than a full lobotomy. The patient could walk out of the room within an hour with only black eyes to complain about. Ellen Ionesco, a young mother with manic depression and self-destructive thoughts, was the first test subject on January 17, 1946. The procedure took half the time of a traditional lobotomy and was judged a success. She was absolutely violently self-destructive beforehand. Ionesco's daughter said,
"After the transorbital lobotomy, there was nothing. It stopped immediately. It was just peace. I don't know how to explain it to you. It was like turning a coin over, that quick. So whatever he did something right."
Ionesco went on to live a long and healthy life, and in 2007, at 88 years old, she still believed Freeman had changed her life for the better. The transorbital lobotomy was immediately criticized, since it did not require full incisions or burr holes like a normal lobotomy, and didn't require the patient to be sedated. Freeman was legally allowed to perform them outside of a hospital and without a formally qualified surgeon like Watts present. That mattered since Watts was not happy with his partner's new methods. Watts insisted on sedation and performing the procedures in the hospital, but Freeman would have none of it. The two men argued fiercely, with Watts asking that Freeman at least stop performing the procedures in their shared office. However, later in 1946, Watts returned to the office to find Freeman operating on a patient in the middle of the room. The orbitoclast was still lodged behind the patient's eye as Freeman casually asked his partner to help him take photos for his records. Watts pulled the plug on their partnership there, and the two men never worked together again. With Watts' restraining influence gone, Freeman's lobotomy craze would only get more extreme. His new method was fast, cheap, and easy to perform, but waiting for patients to come to him wouldn't make a dent in the country's massive asylum population. So in late 1946, Freeman packed up his equipment into a van and began touring around the country to perform lobotomies wherever they were wanted. He jokingly called them headhunting expeditions, as he contacted asylums to arrange rapid-fire lobotomies for multiple patients a day. Freeman's visits were extremely popular. On a typical visit, Freeman would arrive at the asylum in what later commenters dubbed his lobotomobile, with his characteristic cane, hat, and goatee. He'd make a tour of the site and usually give a speech to the staff, patients, and locals who turned out to see him. Then the real work began. The patients would be gathered together in a ward and operated on one by one in rapid succession. The procedure took 20 minutes each, and he would usually perform around 10 of them in a single day trip. The most he ever performed in one day was 25. Ever the showman, Freeman used the visits as entertainment as well as treatment. In one case, he simultaneously performed 2 lobotomies at once, one with each hand, recalling his early lectures where he'd draw parts of the brain with both hands at once. This showmanship wasn't just risky, it was fatal. During one procedure in Iowa's Cherokee Medical Center, Freeman stopped to pose for a photo mid-procedure. As he did, the orbitoclast lodged into his patient's eye and slid down into his brain, causing a fatal hemorrhage that killed him in minutes. Freeman spent years doing lobotomies across the country for private clients, asylums, and even the government. In 1952, Freeman performed 228 transorbital procedures as a part of the West Virginia Lobotomy Project to reduce the asylum population. 4 of the patients died, but most patients saw some improvement. 85 of the patients were sent home, but many others who were supposed to be discharged after the procedure were rejected by their families and stayed in asylums anyway. However, the tide was turning. The development of antipsychotic medication like chlorpromazine in 1955 provided new, less invasive treatments for mental health issues. Actual medical studies were done of lobotomies, which challenged their effectiveness and shone a light on the life-changing consequences that Freeman had brushed off. The lobotomy was no longer seen as a medical miracle, but as a horrible weapon wielded against vulnerable people by medical professionals and their own families. Freeman continued to defend his record and undertake new procedures long after public opinion turned against him. That was until February 1967, when he performed his final lobotomy on Helen Mortensen in Washington. Mortensen had been one of the first 10 transorbital lobotomy patients back in 1946 and had another in 1956, but the third attempt proved fatal. Freeman nicked a blood vessel, causing a brain hemorrhage that killed her. That was the final straw. By now, lobotomies had been thoroughly discredited by science, and Freeman was stripped of his medical license. Freeman died in 1972 at the age of 76, leaving behind one of the most complicated legacies in the history of medicine. On one hand, Freeman conducted rogue surgeries on as many as 3,500 people. Hundreds of those people suffered life-altering or life-ending consequences. Even those he deemed successful were often changed forever, robbed of emotion, independence, or even the memory of who they were before they lay on his operating table. However, his failure to apply scientific rigor to his work, to listen to the medical advice of his peers, or to revise his methods in the face of mounting evidence against lobotomies paints a picture of a man whose ego overtook his ethics. Whether through arrogance, delusion, or shame, he never let go of his pet procedure. America's arch-lobotomist went to his grave believing he had done good, leaving behind a complicated legacy of corpses and cured patients that historians will be unpacking for years to come.